Karen came stomping up my driveway with a rifle slung over her shoulder like she was some kind of suburban warlord. Her face was bright red, either from the blazing summer heat or the fury she was barely holding in. She was yelling something about unauthorized changes to my property, but honestly, I wasn't even listening. What had my full attention was the gun. Last I checked, HOA folks didn't come armed unless they were gearing up for some strange vigilante mission. I stepped outside, leaned on the doorframe, one hand resting in my pocket. My eyes moved from her face to the rifle. She was trembling a bit, clearly borrowing courage from the weapon. I raised an eyebrow and gave her a long, unimpressed look. Really? A gun? For my driveway? I called out, heavy on the sarcasm. I've had people gripe about my lawn, but this is a first. Planning to shoot me over a parking violation? Her eyes went wide, her grip tightening on the rifle. You think this is funny? She snapped, her voice high and shaky. I'm not joking. I'm enforcing the HOA's rules, and you've made a serious mistake. I chuckled. Oh, I'm sure I have. But the real mistake is thinking you can strut onto my property with a rifle like you're part of some neighborhood task force. She stood taller, clearly thinking her threats would scare me. You've been out of compliance for months, and I'm here to put a stop to it. You made unauthorized changes without approval. That's a direct violation. I looked over at my place. My little home, surrounded by a touch of wild landscaping. That's what she was worked up about. My voice went flat as I strolled toward her. You know, it's kind of cute that you think a lawnmower fixes everything. But really, Karen, what gives you the right to show up here with a gun? Did I miss the update where the HOA became a private army? She didn't even blink. Just started rattling off her usual script. The HOA has the right to enforce all rules, and if you think you're above them, you're mistaken. You'll be fined, and if you refuse, I'll make sure you're removed. Gotta hand it to her. She sure sounded like she believed her own nonsense. I let the moment hang. She was fidgeting now, her hands slick on the rifle, face still red. That's when I decided to drop the hammer. I reached behind me, pulled out my badge, and held it up. You might want to lower that gun, Karen. You're talking to the sheriff. For a second, she just stood there like the words didn't make sense. Then it hit. Her eyes went wide, her face drained of color. She stammered, What? You? You're the sheriff? You're just some guy? Just some guy, huh? I said, giving her a slow once-over. Funny, because I've only been sheriff here for, 6 years. Guess that slipped past your radar. The rifle dipped in her hands, her whole posture shifting. Karen had lost control. And I'm not going to lie, it felt good. Now, let me explain why watching her crack was so satisfying. Karen had been a pain for months, filing constant HOA complaints, my fence, my tree, and eventually, even my Jeep. It wasn't even big or loud, just a regular 4x4. But to her, it was some violation of suburban purity. And the whole time, I kept thinking, I'm going to enjoy this. Because Karen, bless her heart, had no clue who she was messing with. She acted like she ran the place, throwing around HOA rules like they were law. But she didn't know how deep the water really ran. What she didn't know was that I'd already been playing my own game. Take her sneaking water from my private well, for instance. Yeah, she did that. Thought she could tap into it for her precious garden. I let it go a few times, but after the 5th complaint about my yard, I'd had it. So I did what any good sheriff would do. I flushed her irrigation system with sewage. Yep, that's me. Freeze frame. The guy whose private well HOA Karen illegally tapped. What did I do? I sent raw sewage through her garden system. And that was just the start. Now before you go, wait, that's illegal. Let me just say, I was fully within my rights. Legal loopholes, folks. Big, glorious ones. Karen didn't have the slightest clue. Not a hint. And right now, as she stood there, rifle sagging in her grip, she wasn't thinking about loopholes. She was just trying to process what she'd done and what was about to come next. Trying to make sense of how she went from being the self-appointed neighborhood enforcer to totally out of her depth. And while Karen was flailing, I'd already moved 2 steps ahead. I wasn't done with her. Not even close. I think you should leave, Karen, I said flatly, before you dig this hole any deeper. Believe me, you really don't want to find out what happens if you push me. Her face turned pale. And just as she started to speak, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Looks like my backup showed up right on time. Karen didn't know that, though. She just stood there, frozen, completely caught off guard. What happened next? Oh, just wait for the next part. Karen stood still, mouth hanging open as the sirens got louder. She glanced around, probably wondering how I managed to bring in reinforcements so fast. Her mind was spinning, and to be honest, I was loving every second. She really thought she could march up to my place, rifle in hand, and push me around. What she didn't realize was, I'm not your average homeowner. Don't even think about it, I said coolly, stepping forward. You don't want to dig yourself in deeper, Karen. Trust me on that. She blinked hard, trying to regain control. Her face was a storm of disbelief and fury, but one thing was missing: control. For once since she barged in, she wasn't calling the shots. You can't just, Karen stuttered, clearly scrambling. This is my neighborhood too. I'm just enforcing the rules. I cocked my head, voice dripping with sarcasm. The rules? Oh, you mean the ones you made up? Because last I checked, the rules didn't include showing up at someone's home with a gun, and I'm pretty sure the HOA doesn't have a personal militia. Her grip on the rifle tightened, but it was obvious she didn't know what to do anymore. The authority she thought she had was vanishing fast. You don't scare me, she snapped, her face flushing. I'll make sure you regret this. The HOA will have you kicked out. I'll have you. I raised an eyebrow before she could finish, letting the pause hit hard. The HOA? I said quietly. Do you even know what the HOA's been up to, Karen? Because I do. That shut her down instantly. Her comeback fizzled as she processed what I'd just said. Here's the deal, I added, stepping back with a smirk. I've been digging into the HOA for months. I know about your backroom deals, the bogus fines, the intimidation. And I know you've been using my water for your little garden project. And Karen, sweetheart, that's not just a policy violation. That's illegal. She went pale. For the first time, she wasn't in charge. She wasn't the HOA queen anymore. Now, she was the one getting the lecture. Her hands shook slightly, lips moving like she couldn't keep up. You're bluffing, Karen said weakly. You've got nothing. You're just a sheriff in this tiny town. You think you scare me? You think I care? I didn't even flinch. I leaned back against my porch railing, arms crossed, posture relaxed, everything she wasn't. Scare you? No, that's not the point, Karen. I'm just here to remind you there's a line. And you've already crossed it. The sirens grew louder. Karen was starting to realize that she was on borrowed time. The more she fought, the worse it was going to end. You've been pulling this stunt for way too long. Karen, I said, voice steady like I was done dealing with a long-time annoyance. Every time you called the HOA to whine about me or anyone else, you just buried yourself deeper. You think I don't know how you've been manipulating fees, preying on people who don't know their rights? This is where that ends. Her face twisted in rage again, but this time it just looked desperate. Her anger didn't carry weight anymore. It only showed how far she was falling. She wanted to scream, but the words didn't come. She could feel everything slipping away. You can't ruin everything, Karen muttered, now clearly afraid. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to. You're the one who's following the rules. I cut in, my voice slicing through hers. Following what rules? The ones that let you steal from your neighbors? The ones that push people to the edge over nonsense violations? That's what you call following the rules, Karen? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a whole lot like criminal behavior. I could see that flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now. She knew I was telling the truth. She knew this wasn't a bluff. And what really rattled her was realizing she had no clue just how far I'd gone in digging into the HOA. She thought I was just some guy too lazy to fight back. But I'd been waiting for this moment, tracking her every step, clocking every slip-up. Karen's hands trembled as she raised the rifle again, but it wasn't with authority anymore. It was like she was trying to convince herself she still had control. You don't know what you're doing, she hissed, her voice shaky under the weight of it all. You think you can just go around ruining people's lives because you don't like the rules? I stepped forward, closing the space between us. I'm not ruining your life. Karen, I said quietly but clearly. I'm just holding you accountable. You've spent long enough making everyone else miserable. Now it's your turn. That's when she broke. In a panic, she let the rifle fall and staggered backward. The act cracked completely, and I could see her thoughts scrambling for an escape plan. But there wasn't one. Not this time. Don't think you're getting away with this, Karen muttered, barely loud enough to hear. I'll fight you. You won't get away with this, I said with a smirk. You're already losing, Karen. But hey, keep trying. You'll get your shot to explain soon enough. Just remember this moment. This is where you realized you messed with the wrong person. And right then, the siren stopped. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Karen was already working through a dozen imaginary outs, but none would hold. Help had arrived, and I was right there, waiting. The only question now was how far she'd go before it really sank in that she'd gone too far. This wasn't the end, it was barely the beginning. I hadn't even made my move yet. But Karen? She was about to find out what happens when you pick a fight with someone who doesn't bluff. And that's when things were about to get interesting. What came next? Let's just say Karen had no idea how deep this went. But she was about to. The sirens went silent at the foot of my driveway, and the slam of car doors echoed through the street. I didn't bother glancing back. Karen's face was frozen in disbelief, and I could feel the shift. I could practically hear her thoughts spinning, trying to figure out how it all went sideways. She was still clutching that rifle like it was going to protect her from what was coming. "Think you might want to set that down now, Karen," I said, giving a nod toward the officers stepping out of their cruisers. "You've had your fun, but it's over." The officers approached, scanning the situation with quick, practiced eyes. They didn't need much explanation. I knew most of them. Hell, half of them had probably gotten HOA complaints too. That board had a reputation for going after the wrong people, and folks were done putting up with it. I stepped back to give the officers room. Karen's eyes bounced between them, and for the first time, she looked scared. The rifle that once gave her confidence now looked like a bad mistake. The officers didn't need me to spell it out. They were already on it. "Ma'am," one of them said calmly but firmly, "we're going to need you to step aside. We'll handle this from here." Karen was already scrambling, tossing out excuses, trying to untangle herself. "You don't get it. This is all wrong. I was enforcing the rules. He's the one breaking the law. He's been doing it for months." Her voice was cracking, climbing in pitch, panic bleeding through. But it didn't matter anymore. There was no way out. The officer glanced my way, then back at her, waiting for her to understand that she was out of options. "What rules, Karen?" he asked. "You can explain all that back at the station. But right now, you're holding an illegal firearm, and that's a bit more serious than your HOA complaints." Her face drained of color. And I'll admit it, I felt a little smug. Because this wasn't just about a weapon. This was about the way she had used the HOA to bully the entire neighborhood. She was finally about to get what was coming to her. "Anything to add, Sheriff?" one of the officers asked, cutting through the tension. I gave him a dry smile. "Yeah," I said, with a touch of sarcasm. "Might want to ask her about how she's been siphoning water from my private well to keep her garden green. She might be able to explain that better than I can." The officer narrowed his eyes. Karen's expression twisted in confusion, but that faded fast. It looked like the reality of what she'd done was starting to catch up with her, piece by piece. The other officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs and stepped toward her. The second she tried to pull away, he grabbed her wrist. "No, you can't do this. This is all a misunderstanding," Karen shouted, panic flooding her voice. I didn't feel sorry for her, not even a little. She'd pushed people around for so long, she thought nothing could touch her. But now it was all crashing down. Every bogus complaint she made, every fine she handed out, every made-up violation. Now it was all coming back around. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for possession of an illegal weapon, among other charges," the officer said, voice firm. Karen didn't resist the cuffs, but the look in her eyes said she was still searching for a way out, trying to process that she'd finally crossed a line she couldn't step back from. But it was too late. The officer turned to me again, his expression softening just a little. "Looks like you've got some paperwork to do, Sheriff." "Yeah," I said, exhaling slow. "And it's not going to be quick. Probably best to start logging everything Karen did with her little HOA operation. You wouldn't believe half of it." They walked Karen to the cruiser while I stood there, letting everything sink in. What started as a typical HOA headache turned into something much bigger. Now, Karen was about to get a taste of the chaos she dished out for years, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. But this wasn't just about taking her down. It meant more than that. The HOA had turned into a parasite, people using small authority to control others. And Karen? She wasn't the cause. She was just a symptom. The HOA itself was the rot. I headed back toward my porch, feeling like a weight had lifted, at least for now. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen's arrest was just the start. There was still so much buried. The HOA had been hiding their tracks for years, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing fell apart. I looked over my shoulder as the cruisers pulled away. Karen, who once acted like she ran the show, was now just another name on a booking sheet. And the best part? That was just the beginning. I knew the second she got out, she'd come for me. I saw it in her face. And I was ready. Because this wasn't finished. Not even close. I stood on the porch, took a breath, the warm wind brushing against my skin, and I knew one thing for sure. Karen's time holding the reins was over. And now the real show was about to begin. But she had no idea what was coming. That's what made it so satisfying. The sun dipped low, casting the sky in a soft orange glow as I sat on the porch with a cold drink in hand. A few days had passed since Karen was cuffed and hauled off, and things around here were unusually quiet. Of course, people were still buzzing. In a small town like ours, word travels fast. Everyone was still wrapping their heads around what went down. But for me, it felt like a pause before the next act. Karen might be out of the picture temporarily, but there was no way she'd stay quiet. Not after everything. I knew she'd make a move, and I was ready for it. The HOA had made a serious miscalculation. They assumed I'd just roll over. Karen made the same mistake, thought she could shove me around because I was just another neighbor. What she didn't realize was that I'd been watching, quietly gathering dirt, tracking Karen, the board, the way they operated. And I hadn't even gotten to the good stuff yet. I heard a car in the distance and looked down the street. Sure enough, she was back. But she didn't come alone. She brought a lawyer. Of course. She'd need someone to try and clean up the mess. I stood up and walked to the end of the driveway. Karen's car pulled up and stopped right in front of my place. The door opened, and she stepped out. She looked worn down, her hair disheveled, no trace of that smug, neighborhood queen attitude. Now she just looked tired, like someone who'd been knocked down hard. I didn't feel bad. "Sheriff," she hissed, eyes narrowed. "You really think you've won, huh?" I leaned against the mailbox, in no rush to respond. Her lawyer stepped out, arms folded, wearing that classic look like he thought he could scare me with a stare. But I wasn't the one intimidated. I'd been waiting for this exact moment. Karen never once looked this far down the road. She was too wrapped up in herself, thinking her power trip and petty rules could keep everyone in line. What she didn't realize was that the same system she counted on was the one about to take her down. "You're out of jail," I said, letting the sarcasm hang in the air. "Guess you didn't think your little stunt would blow up like this, huh?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her mouth shut. At least for now. She was on her heels, clearly out of her depth. She had no clue what was coming. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Karen said under her breath. "You think this is done? You're wrong. The HOA has deep pockets, and I'm not the only one who can make your life hell." I took a slow sip of my drink and smiled. "Oh, Karen, I think you're missing the point. This stopped being about you a long time ago. I've already spoken to a few folks. I've got evidence. Everything you've pulled, every shady move the HOA's made. You've made more enemies than you realize. I'm just the first one showing up." I caught a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was quick, but it was there. Her lawyer shifted beside her, eyeing her with unease, but she stayed locked on me. She knew exactly what I meant. She'd treated the HOA like her own kingdom, bleeding money out of folks who couldn't push back. But now that I had something solid, the story had changed. "You think you've got something on me?" Karen scoffed, letting out a shaky laugh. "You think you can just tear down everything I've built?" I took a step closer, voice calm. "I'm not tearing down anything, Karen. You're doing that perfectly fine on your own." She was starting to get it now. Her confidence cracked, and I saw the panic creeping in. Her lawyer looked tense, but stayed silent. He probably knew he couldn't save her from this. "Want to hear what I've got?" I asked, raising a brow. "You might want to sit down." She hesitated, wanted to dismiss me, but she knew. She knew I had the goods, every document, every email, all the dirt she thought was buried. I had proof of those illegal fines, the unauthorized tap on my well, the under-the-table contractor deals. And it wasn't just her. The whole HOA was in it, and I was going to make sure the truth got out. "You've been using the HOA like a weapon," I said slowly, watching her face twist. "And I'm not the only one who noticed. I've got others, people who've been keeping tabs, waiting for the right moment to speak up." Karen's eyes widened, her breathing sped up. She was finally grasping just how deep this went. But I wasn't finished. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've been doing," I said. "Not just this town. I've already connected with people who can do more than gossip. We're talking real fallout." She took a step back, her face falling as it hit her. "You can't do this. You." "I already am," I said, cutting her off. "And your HOA shield? It's gone. This is bigger than you now, Karen. This is about finally holding people accountable. I could feel the relief building in me. Watching Karen unravel, seeing her finally realize she wasn't untouchable, it felt like every grudge, every injustice was finally being answered. The justice she clung to so tightly was now out of her reach. And I wasn't about to let her get it back. Karen turned to her lawyer, voice low and desperate. "Do something," she said. But all he gave her was a shrug. He knew it was over. "Don't worry," I said as I turned back toward the porch. "You'll have your day in court. But trust me, it won't end the way you think." I walked away, leaving her and her lawyer standing there in silence. The neighborhood had been watching. I didn't know exactly how this would wrap up, but I knew one thing for sure. Karen's grip on power was broken. The wind picked up as I reached the steps, and a quiet, satisfying calm settled in my chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person she'd tried to control, every line she'd crossed. And now? Now it was our turn. And it felt damn good.